Hi, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to our session today. My name is Jamaica Jones. I have the great pleasure of working with Ted Haberman on the INFORMATE project. We'll be telling you about our work on that project in this presentation that we've titled Making the Invisible Visible, Connecting Institutional Repositories to the Global Research Infrastructure. Before we get started, I wanted to just introduce you to us as people. Ted Haberman will be running much of the show today. He's the PI on this project. It's a project that's been generously supported through an NSF Eager grant. Ted is the Chief Information Officer of, is that right? Or you're the co-founder and the chief game changer at Metadata Game Changers, I think is your real title. I work with him as a researcher on the project. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh, as you see on the screen. I also work for NASA. I wear many hats. As a project coordinator of the NASA TOPS mission, and in that role, I serve as the executive secretary of the OSTP subgroup on the Year of Open Science, which is one of the groups that helped bring the Year of Open Science to center stage last year. So thank you all for tuning in. We're grateful for your time at the end of a day that I know has been full of a lot of information and really great discussion. So Ted, go ahead, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Jamaica. Um, the first question I wanted to ask, or I wanted to try and answer, is what is the global research infrastructure? It's a term that we use quite a bit, and it's maybe a new term for some people, but I think everybody is familiar with it at this meeting. It's comprised of repositories and organizations that provide persistent identifiers with metadata for those identifiers about research objects and the connections between those objects, researchers, funders, research institutions, and one another. We're going to give it a little more detail on this in the next couple slides, but that's sort of what we think of when we talk about the global research infrastructure. It is global, it's growing, it's changing, and many exciting talks today about new things in the global research infrastructure. We want to give you a cautionary note at the beginning. This is sort of the takeaway message of what we're talking about. What you get out of the research of any research infrastructure, but certainly the global one, is what you put in. So what we are thinking about is what gets put into the research infrastructure, and how does that affect how we can use it. So we're back to the definition. One of the large repositories in the global research infrastructure is Crossref. It's primarily research articles. Since 2018, there are 29 million articles in Crossref. They've existed prior to that time, but this is the most recent time. And there's almost 6 million of those articles have funder metadata. All of the articles have various article metadata, but one of the things we were interested in Crossref, and you'll see why in a minute, is the funder metadata that's in Crossref. At the dataset side of the equation is DataCite. DataCite is another big repository, has 53 million DOIs, 30 different resource types. Probably the large ones in this case are text and data sets, and the new kid on the block, which is physical samples. Those are the three largest groups within DataCite. There's 3,000 member repositories of the DataCite. We'll be looking at some today from universities. In the middle of this picture is Scholar Explorer, website, a repository run in the EU, which has over 375 million links. This is a link repository. Has 37 million, over 37 million data sets in links to over 37 million data sets in Scholar Explorer, and over 13,000 publishers for research papers. So these are three large elements of the global research structure. They're not the only ones. And there are the three that we're going to focus on in this talk. So the question that we want to try and address is, how can this global research infrastructure contribute to open science? One of the first requirement for the global research infrastructure to be helpful is metadata completeness. So this is a schematic diagram that shows that these all three of these repositories have some level of completeness. The height of these is schematic in this case because metadata completeness is it's not just a single number for a repository. It's a complex metadata completeness for certain elements, for certain use cases, at certain times. All these things change. So metadata completeness it's not a simple, there are a lot of interesting questions that are related to metadata completeness. One of those questions has to do with using community recommendations in order to measure completeness against. Communities have use cases and use case needs that might need specific metadata elements. So you want to know how fit for use or how complete are these metadata for this community in these use cases. So one of the most commonly discussed set of use cases are the FAIR principles. I think about this as four different use cases, and testing the fairness of DataCite is a little bit unfair actually, because the principal use case for DataCite is in as described in their schema document is identification and citation. So identification and citation is mostly falling in F&A, but I wanted to also highlight that the way that the community thinks about DataCite is a different use case, which is get a DOI as soon as possible with minimal work and minimal metadata. So this sort of get DOI ASAP use case, it turns out, is used quite a bit that will be highlighted or elucidated by the next few results. So the schema I mentioned has a lot of fields in it which are relevant to the FAI and R and FAIR. There's a few lists of things here that you can look at, but the first two are related to FAIR or findability. The third and fourth one are related to the AI and R in FAIR. And the first one is really a set of text elements, things that people would search for with text. So things that you can see at the beginning of the list, abstract and title, are two very common text fields that people find in searches, but there are about a total of 15 of these in the DataCite schema. The second set is really identifiers. We know from the Nelson memo that identifiers are important and maybe increasingly important. There are about 14 fields in DataCite related to identifiers. The third part, getting into AI and R, is connections between things and types of connections between things. About 18 of those in DataCite. And the final one for reusability is really contacts. You need in the metadata to know who you can ask questions about the data that you're trying to reuse. There are about 11 of those things. So altogether, there are 58 or so FAIR elements in the DataCite schema. Now the question is how many of those are used in metadata is the sort of the completeness question that we want to ask here. So we took about 387 university repositories, all of which had more than 100 records. All told, this is something like 50,000 records out of DataCite, and we searched for those metadata elements that were in the last slide in those repositories. This slide shows the number of repositories on the y-axis. On the x-axis, it's the percentage of elements in that group that the repository holds. So we can see that the most common number here, the most common completeness level in these repositories is 40 to 50%, and about 160 of the 380 university repositories have that completeness. That means for all those elements that I showed in the last slide for text, abstract, title, author names, etc., the most common completeness of those is somewhere between 40 and 50%. DataCite also has mandatory fields, and those mandatory fields are mostly related to identification and citation, as I said earlier. And it turns out that if you have the mandatory fields, this is where you show up. You show up at 40 to 50% on this plot. And then, so what this plot really shows is that most repositories have the mandatory fields, and of course, they need those mandatory fields to get that DOI as quickly as possible. So it's not surprising that it's common, and then it falls off sort of quickly above that. There are a few below that, and those snuck in somehow. I'm not sure how, but none of these repositories have more than 80% of the text fields. If we look at the other pictures, other three groups of records, and leaving text on here, we can see that identifiers, which are sort of at the heart of the Nelson memo, the most common completeness level there is 10 to 20%, which is about 160 repositories. Again, a few are above that, but none are above 50%. Going into looking at metadata elements that support the air and fair connections, about the same as identifiers. 10 to 20% is the most common completeness. And once again, only a very few repositories above 40%. Finally, contacts. The most common completeness here is 0 to 10%, with really not very much above even 20%. So if we take these observations and sort of summarize them, it turns out that most DataCite repositories focus only on the mandatory fields that they need to get the DOIs quickly and with minimal metadata. So findability is supported to some extent. Really still around 50% of the things that could be there are there. And as we go up into the more the higher levels of fairness, AI and R, the amount of metadata in DataCite really falls off. So one of the important sort of takeaway here is the difference between a metadata schema and metadata that has in so many cases just the mandatory fields. So DataCite has the capability to be very fair, to has a number, we saw 60 elements across the spectrum, but only a few of those are used because of the way that the members of DataCite think about, just give me a DOI, thank you very much. Okay, so the second repository requirement for open science is consistency. So consistency means that metadata elements across these different elements or these different pieces of the global research infrastructure have consistent values for the metadata elements. And then we're also interested in institutional repositories, which in this case means not only repositories associated with universities, as we usually think of, but also repositories associated with federal funders as institutions. We need to have consistent metadata elements across those repositories, and then also, importantly, consistent metadata elements between those repositories and the global research infrastructure, so that we can compare and make those connections between these repositories. So the global research, to look at across the global research infrastructure rather than just a DataCite, which we did in the last example, we are partnering with a group called Chorus. Chorus provides views into the global research infrastructure that combine Crossref and Scholar Explorer and DataCite. And this is why we are focusing on these three pieces of the global research infrastructure. And Chorus creates analysis ready. I think of them as analysis ready reports for funders and publishers by pulling together information from the global research infrastructure. In the last session, there was a great lightning talk about, so when you are reusing data, you need to be able to understand how it was created. We're reusing this data that's extracted by Chorus, and we want to know how it's created, because we're trying to understand its idiosyncrasies that we might identify. So I have an extra ORCID ID sitting in the middle of this picture, but so this is the data journey for Chorus. It starts out with a funding agency that has a funder ID or a ROR, and some researchers that are supported by that funding agency to create a paper that goes into Crossref and gets a DOI. Notice that there's 3 different kinds of identifiers here already: RORs for the funding agency, DOIs for the paper, and ORCIDs for the researchers. Chorus then makes a query against Crossref to get items that are funded by a funder. That is why the completeness of funders in Crossref that I mentioned earlier is really important, because it controls this view that Chorus creates. Chorus then creates an all report from that, the Crossref metadata. Researchers are also creating data sets, and inputting those data sets into DataSite to share them, and they get a data set DOI in that case. And Scala Explorer, I mentioned earlier, as a repository of links. When you give it an article DOI, you can get back dataset DOIs that point to DataSite and other places. And then Chorus harvests that DataSite metadata for those into something called the dataset report. So these 2 reports that are created by Chorus pull together a bunch of different pieces from the global research infrastructure. The thing that we like about it is there are articles which have DOIs. There are data sets which have DOIs, and then there are links between these things. And articles plus links plus data are connections. And we're very interested in understanding these connections. There have been a few talks earlier today, and I'm sure there'll be more tomorrow, that talk about data sets that are linked to papers. And so understanding those connections is really important, and making these connections really depends a lot on consistency across the metadata in these different repositories. So if we look at what data sets are connected, this is from Chorus for 3 different agencies: U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the National Science Foundation. 100% is across the top of this plot, and that's so the orange is 100%, and the blue areas are the percentage of papers that have connected data that's discovered using the data journey that I just described. USAID are sort of early right now in the identifier adoption process. USGS and NSF are sort of have been doing this for much longer. And in their cases, they have roughly 20% of the data sets 20% of the papers have connected data sets. So this is another area of sort of completeness of those connections. And there are a number of people in this conference and around the world that are trying to increase these numbers. And obviously that's going to give us more information about these connections as that happens. Another important part about metadata consistency has to do with awards and award numbers. A couple of people today have talked about awards. Obviously, we're interested in measuring the impact of awards and understanding that impact. So it's very important that awards are expressed consistently across these different repositories. We took a look at award numbers again through Chorus, but It essentially means we're looking into cross-ref metadata through Chorus. So we wanted to keep that. We need to keep the provenance of the data we're looking at in mind. And this award number here, 1548562, maybe some of you know that. It's a very commonly, it is the Exceed Computer Resource Award, and it's acknowledged over 1,600 times. And it's written more than 50 ways. So this is just a sample of the 50 ways, and you can see, maybe there's a song in this, the 50 ways to write your award number. But so finding these award numbers in these grant strings is somewhat of a challenge, and that's something we try to do. By the way, the NSF colon on the beginning of these strings is information that Chorus gives us so that we can understand where the funder is for this award number. And so it's not part of the award number in this case, but it's consistently across all of these because we selected them as being NSF. So this is a sort of an interesting plot, and I wanted to explain it because I don't know if people have done it before. But on the y-axis is the number of occurrences of an award number. So as we go from the bottom up to the top, it means that these are award numbers that are acknowledged more and more. And then on the x-axis is the number of ways that the award number is written. So this one here is used 575 times and written 16 different ways. And obviously finding these 16 different ways that I showed earlier for that other award is a challenge. And just I tend to be a visual learner. So what do we want this picture to look like? What's the goal that we're moving for? This picture looks like this. We have awards that are acknowledged many times, and that's a great thing. It means that the research investment by NSF is paying off, but we want those things to be written one way. And many of you are probably aware of the fact that Crossref and others are working on using persistent things, DOIs specifically now for award numbers, and that's going to help. Maybe that's going to help in consistency, but it also means these inconsistencies, or we're going to have to deal with this inconsistency as we try and get new identifiers for past awards into the infrastructure. And so here's what our target looks like. Here's a couple of examples. This is a good-looking NSF award number right up until you realize that it has 7 digits. And NSF award numbers, or it has 8 digits, sorry. NSF award numbers have 7 digits. So there's something going on here that's not good. Here's another sort of a good-looking one, but then unfortunately this one only has 6 digits. So, these simple tests like how many digits are there in this number can help us find, in this case, 1 or 2% of award numbers that are missing. But as we'll see, that it turns out to be sort of a large number. Fortunately, using the computers to help us in this search, we were able to find 64% of the award numbers. This is looking in that cross-ref metadata with directorates and divisions, and with just award numbers, we found 29%. So of a total of 434,000 grant IDs written into cross-ref metadata, we found 403,000 award numbers. We're now using the NSF award database to validate those, but there's still almost 32,000 32,000 things that have grant metadata where we can't find the award numbers in the strings. Humans can help us maybe find some of those, but there's still quite a few missing. So that we need to make sure these things are written consistently. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it back to Jamaica for more discussion of consistency.
Thanks, Ted. I am was startled by your ability to marry two of my great loves, which is award numbers and Paul Simon. Thank you for that. That was a really nice end of day treat. Um, I'm going to take over for the next few minutes and talk about some of the challenges and potential benefits of connecting institutional repositories in particular to the global research infrastructure. Ted was kind enough a few slides ago to have introduced this idea. It's one of the major concepts of the work that we're doing together. But I'm going to be taking a bit of a deeper dive, focusing specifically on federal agencies, institutional repositories, and more specifically yet, on the U.S. Geological Survey's publication warehouse and on the National Science Foundation's public access repository, which is referred to as PAR for short. It's an interesting pair to consider, as straight away when we take a look at these repositories, we encounter some of the differences in research communities that end up emerging from a lot of meta science research. A key distinction that's relevant here between USGS and NSF is that USGS produces primarily intramural research, while NSF is, of course, effectively all extramural. This difference shows up in the purpose and the function of their repositories. The USGS Pubs Warehouse, for instance, houses works that are published by their intramural researchers, so they're in-staff researchers, in-house researchers, and they're interested in course then to help them identify additional works that are published by the researchers that they fund who are not USGS employees. Could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. The USGS view then, or interest in working with chorus data, is an outward-looking approach. And this slide helps to illuminate the kinds of questions that USGS is interested in asking of the chorus data, showing the results of here. This was one of our most preliminary inquiries into the data. It shows the results of an article DOI comparison between the USGS Pubs warehouse data and the Chorus All report. And we can see that of the roughly 6,000 articles in the Chorus All report for USGS, about 3,500 of those are in the Pubs warehouse, while about 2,500 are external. Next slide, please. There we go. Working with a different Chorus report, this is the dataset report that Ted introduced a few minutes ago in the data journey slide. It provides metadata on data sets that are linked to specific funders. And we were able to create a view of broader connections using Neo4j to create this plot that depicts relationships between data sets funded by more than one agency. This one provides yet even more of an outward view for the USGS, showing funding connections with NASA and with NSF, and some that were funded by all three. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please, if you don't mind. There you go. Now, turning our attention to NSF's PAR, we can run the same initial analysis using DOIs, and we come up with a different story. Here we're showing the results suggesting that of roughly 215,000 articles in the Chorus All report for NSF, about 77,500 are documented in PAR. In this case, those DOIs that aren't represented don't depict the work of extramural researchers. Instead, what they do suggest is the nature of metadata completeness in PAR. Here we're seeing DOI completeness coming in at around 36%, with about 140,000 out of a known 215,000 DOIs in the Chorus All report going unrepresented in PAR. Next slide, please. I just used the word known. I do feel personally indebted to Donald Rumsfeld for his gift of the framework of known knowns, known unknowns, and the dreaded unknown unknowns. I find it remarkably useful, especially when considering the matter of denominators. We can classify denominators here as known unknowns. If you're unfamiliar, denominator is a term that might be familiar to many of our agency partners and quite likely a few others who have spent time trying to measure the scope and impact of a given body of research. Contextualized for the purposes of this conversation, we can understand the denominator to be the total number of resources to have emerged in this context from NSF funding. This number is critical in contextualizing the number of resources in PAR, as you can see here. We can calculate there to be about 77,500 PAR resources with publication dates between 2014 14 in 2022. But to know what percentage of the total, this requires a denominator that, working from PAR data alone, we don't know, we can't know. Next slide. Working with the chorus data, though, we can begin to get a sense of what this number is. If we take the chorus all report in particular to be representative of what exists across the global research infrastructure, which for the purposes of our project, the INFORMATE project, we can calculate that of the 77,500 resources in PAR, about 36 of so that 77,500 represents about 36% of courses known total of 215,655. Using the course all report, then, we can estimate the denominator in terms of what's documented across the global research infrastructure. Next slide. We can also take a different approach and consider the denominator in terms of the number of awards granted. This approach works from the assumption that each award might reasonably be expected to produce at least one publication. To run related analyses, we downloaded award metadata from an awards database that's maintained by NSF, and we ran comparisons over award numbers. Our results revealed that of the roughly 173,000 grants awarded by NSF between 2004 and 2023, only about 6%, or just about 11,000 of them, are referenced in PAR metadata. Next slide. We're presenting this a little bit differently and with some greater context here. In the pie chart on the right-hand side, you can see the same figures that I just read presented a different way. On the left, you can see the course comparison. Of that same 173,522 awards, about 34% are referenced in chorus metadata. Ted gave a hint as to why this might be a few minutes ago when emphasizing the fact that chorus metadata come from Crossref, at least the award numbers do. So if you're wondering why chorus in particular doesn't show higher rates of award number inclusions in its metadata, Ted has postulated that it might have something to do with the metadata completeness in the Crossref metadata during that time frame. Whatever the case, these are indeed questions of metadata completeness, and they're themselves dependent on metadata consistency. When we do this work, we do encounter a good bit of variation in DOI and award number values, again, as Ted has already introduced, and this variation can complicate our research. Next slide, please. Here in this slide, for example, we're showing NSF award number values in course metadata can range from lengths of single to triple digits. You'll recall from an earlier slide that an NSF award number is 7 digits long, and that I'm not sure if this was introduced, but chorus appends a prefix of NSF : to whatever award number values they receive. So in the chorus all report, the correct number of characters for an NSF award number is 11. You'll see that that's the second most common number here. The most common number is 15, resulting from the inclusion of division and directorate abbreviations prior to those 7 digits. This presentation of award numbers occurs in the chorus all report just under 80,000 times. Next slide, please. And we found that a similar story is true for DOIs. Here we've calculated just the character counts of DOI strings in PAR metadata and found that in the data set we obtained, the most common character count for a DOI in PAR is 42. The reason for this, we discovered, is that the data set we were working from included DOI data that had been prepended with a string of 16 additional digits. Even with this taken into account, however, our preliminary analysis revealed DOI character counts ranging into the hundreds. It's important to emphasize here that these results are preliminary, and that the same way that we did work to validate award numbers, we do still need to do that to validate the DOI data in particular. However, taking a look just at these raw figures, we can get a sense of the variation that can and regularly does occur in metadata across the global research infrastructure. This can give us a sense of some of the challenges encountered by those of us who wish to leverage this infrastructure in pursuit of its greatest potential. Our work in this project is not to count problems, however. Much to the contrary, we're interested in characterizing the landscape such that we might better understand what opportunities there are inherent in it. So, towards that end, I'll be turning things back over to Ted now to close us out with some successes and some preliminary recommendations that we have to offer.
Thanks very much, Jamaica. Yeah, so from the completeness and consistency examples, I hope that we gave you a, a view of a number of elements of completeness and consistency problems that we're identifying and trying to characterize. Of course, measuring these things quantitatively is important to define a baseline that we can also measure improvement in terms of. But the first conclusion is really that global research infrastructure metadata must go beyond mandatory fields to support open science and actually put the air in FAIR or other community recommendations. Just the mandatory fields are not enough. Second, the global research infrastructure metadata must be populated, again, the completeness thing, and validated to facilitate reliable connections between repositories. And of course, as Jamaica pointed out, we've found some problems, we found some opportunities, but there also are a few successes that I just wanted to mention. This first one is a study of institutional repositories funded by NSF. And in this case, it's just a single repository that I'm showing, but it's representative of actually all of the repositories. And in this case, along the x-axis, we have those four groups of elements that we showed before: text, identifiers, connections, and contacts, and also total. And of course, when you look at this picture, you see, oh, text is above everything else, but then you realize that it's basically 40%. So it just reflects mandatory fields. And this reflects that use case, or that it's really the thought process that institutional repository managers have of just, I just want to grab a DOI from DataSite. I don't want to take advantage of the other elements in the DataSite metadata schema that might improve the fairness of my metadata. So we took those institutional repositories and built some tools for taking other things that are in those repositories, putting them into DataSite, and then measuring the fairness again, and voila, as we would expect, of course, we see an increase. But the important point here is this is existing content. This is content that exists in DataSite, in the institutional repositories, that could also enhance and improve the usability across a variety of use cases of DataSite. And so it's not a metadata problem here. It's a tool problem of the tools not translating this metadata or migrating this metadata, and also the way that people are currently thinking about the research infrastructure. There's been a lot of discussion so far today about open science being a cultural change, and I just wanted to really bring that up because this is an example of that. Many of us are familiar with the Dryad repository, and Dryad sort of has two time periods: the old Dryad and the new Dryad, and affiliations and RORs. RORs are organizational identifiers. There were none of those in the metadata model earlier for the old Dryad. So one of the things that we did with California Digital Library when they took over Dryad was to see what we could do. More recently, in the new Dryad, they add these identifiers during the submission process. And Amanda French showed earlier today what that interface looks like, the ROR interface in Dryad. But what we were doing was trying to extend these identifiers to the past in a process that we call recuration, curating these things again. And what this figure shows is the number of affiliations and RORs after this process. And the exciting thing about this, despite the little dip during the time when we were doing this, is that we can find in recuration about the same amount of identifiers that we're actually finding during initial curation processes. So this shows that we can take the back history, the back collection in repositories, which is large, of course, and bring that up to current capabilities. So that's super. And so recuration is finding stuff and adding it into the metadata. And for instance, for the Nelson memo, this is super important since the Nelson memo emphasizes the importance of identifiers. And this shows we can extend the benefits of adding these identifiers into the metadata, into the past, which of course is very important. So the conclusions, complete and consistent metadata are required for open science to benefit from the growing global research infrastructure. It's growing fast, it's changing, it's evolving. We want to be able to take advantage of that. DataCite metadata schema includes many elements that can support fair data, but they're generally not populated. That's the sort of the culture change that we need to try and encourage. And then metadata provided by users must be validated by journals and repositories to enable comparisons across the global research infrastructure and with institutional repositories, and of course, also to enable connections between these things. So that is our last slide. I'm going to stop this share, and we're ready to take questions. I think that's... Yeah.
There was a question that came in through the chat when you were closing things out. Katie asks, by institutional repositories supported by NSF, do you mean those at universities?
Trying to remember. Oops. Institutional repositories supported by NSF. Of course, NSF supports some institutional repositories, and so do other agencies. NASA, for instance, has the DAX, USGS, Jamaica mentioned. In my experience, repositories at universities, the sort of classic institutional repositories, are supported by however they can get money. And all of them have resource challenges, trying to fund the development and the continued maintenance of those resources. So there's many people at this meeting that know more. Martin is here about repositories that NSF funds, but their role in funding university repositories is not. I don't think they have a major role there. I could be wrong, but things like UCAR, for instance, has institutional repositories. The NSF is a significant funder of UCAR, but so I don't mean NSF supported repositories.
Thanks, Ted. Yeah, I may have just heard you wrong. I was wondering if in the research that you all did, if when you were talking about institutional repositories, if you meant those ones at institutions that are, funded by kind of whatever they can, find and things like that. So that was my question. Thanks.
Yeah, the one example that I showed where we were improving metadata from an institutional repository, it was at a research university funded in various ways.
There's also a question that came in through the Q&A from Anna. Could you tell us a bit more about how the recuration was done in Dryad? And I saw you come off, you turn your camera on. Do you want to present your own question? I'm happy to read it, but...
Either way, I was just trying to help out. Hi.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
So the recuration that was done in Dryad, did this rely on previously included metadata that was transformed into RORs, or was this information gathered another way? How many records were involved? This is a great idea, but the scalability across millions of records presents a challenge that requires some automation.
Anna, you're definitely right. Automation required.
You know how many records there are in Figshare, so you can figure where my question comes from.
Yes, I'm well aware of that. So the old Dryad was built around the idea that I have a data set and I have a paper. I'm trying to publish this paper and I want to connect this data set to it. So a lot of the metadata that was involved to describe those data sets was sort of thought of as coming from the paper. So the original metadata model at Dryad up until late in the teens did not include affiliations of authors. It did have author names, but no affiliation. There was no University of Colorado at Boulder. And there were certainly no RORs. But when California Digital Library took over the back end of Dryad, ROR was also just emerging. So we took those the metadata did include the DOIs, the cross-ref DOIs for papers that were related to these data sets. So we use those cross-ref DOIs to search cross-ref for affiliation strings. We had roughly 20,000 data sets, which gives us somewhere in the 100 to 200,000 affiliation strings. Some number of those are unique. And then we wrote the first algorithms that anyone was using to try and get RORs for those, and then we inserted those RORs back into the Dryad metadata that then went to DataCite. So it was, and I've done similar things with many lists of affiliations from many repositories, and the the diversity of those affiliation strings still requires sort of some human in the loop. So even though I can find many RORs, there are still some that are sort of funny. And I have a few blogs about that. The biggest problems is that people tend to write affiliations with acronyms. So NSF, many of us don't realize that it stands for the National Sleep Foundation. And it also stands for the Neil Simon Foundation and many things other than the National Science Foundation, which is actually what most people mean. So if you have, people need to write affiliations clearly and succinctly if they're not just putting in a ROR somehow themselves. But yeah, automation is important and it's critical. And I mean, 1 million records, that'll take a while, but it'll chug through.
Well, you have to have the paper to rely on it if you don't have the metadata, right? So yeah. Pull it from somewhere else. And you could do the same thing with the funding. If the funding is acknowledged in the paper, but not in the data set, could you pull the funding metadata from the paper and infer that the funding is probably the same for the data set?
Yeah. I also have a blog post about doing exactly that. And finding funder information is a challenge. Tim Vines gave a talk earlier today about DataSeer, and DataSeer is finding this. It's a tool for finding this information in full text. And I think that those full text searches, even with the emergence of AI and things like that, is also going to be a great way for finding data sets and funding information in these historic papers. So I'm looking forward to that.
Martin, please everybody, you can feel free to come off mute. And just to say verbally, we do recognize that we're officially over time. So if you need to go, please feel free. Thank you for joining us.
I just wanted to say a wonderful presentation. I learned a tremendous amount, as I always do, from listening to you two. In fact, I wanted to ask if I could use at least one of your images in the concluding plenary that I'm going to do tomorrow, because I think it was a great illustration of something that I wanted to talk about. It was the shared data set image that you had up at one point, Jamaica.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If that's okay with you, I would love to use it. Thank you.
Martin, you have a blanket permission to use any image from any presentation that I've ever given.
Well, thank you, Ted, and thank you for your presentation.
Jamaica, do you want to send that image to Martin?
Yeah, yeah, I can do that.
I already snapped it. I already got it and put it in the presentation.
You know, one thing about that image is, you know, in this contrast between agencies measuring impact and the global research infrastructure, is seeing those connections for funded things from multiple agencies is something that you don't get out of the USGS publication warehouse or PAR or sort of
Exactly.
seeing those. And that's one of the nice things about the global research infrastructure is it's independent of point of view, sort of.
And I'll enhance or pile on or ditto your comments about the fact that well, for example, the section 4 of the Nelson Memorandum is specifically talking about enhancing metadata interlinkages in exactly the ways that you've highlighted in this presentation. So again, good show. Thank you.
You know, I should say that Martin was fundamental in supporting this work and we developed it in many discussions with him. So it's great to see you. Thank you, Martin, and we're excited about the results too. Okay. Any other questions?
Just a comment. I echo Martin's words. This is fantastic presentation, Jamaica and Ted. And all the data and charts that you showed really piqued my mind. Is like, how does this look for NIH? And so, I think it really begs the question to be looking at the data and seeing how it shakes out and where the gaps are and how to fill them. So thank you again for sharing this. It's fantastic.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Believe it or not, I've also wondered how it might look for NIH. But it's sort of also interesting with that data journey that we showed, that even whether the data are metadata or the data are clinical trials or something, we're really trying to reproduce the chorus results. And we're fortunate enough to be working with Howard and Tara at Chorus. And so we give them questions when we run into these questions. And so it's really also a real world experiment in data reuse. But we would be happy to talk to you at some point about NIH or also the other gray, the gray initiative repositories that you're so driving that work, which is really great.
Absolutely. Anna and I were just exchanging notes in the chat about doing exactly that. So we will reach out. This is just our private chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But thank you again.
Yeah, definitely. It'd be very helpful for some of the great things, and the AI component tying in with the finding the funding as well is something we want to address with metadata QA/QC and AI. So hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, finding funders is a challenge. Okay.
Oh. Thank you all for coming. Looks like everybody's dropping away, so.